Okay, well, let's go to our next speaker, Stan Grant, who's going to talk about restoring catchment hydrology.
Thank you, Rich. And like I said, I think that your talk is a great segue, as is Tim's actually, to what I wanted to chat about, which is really about, I think we all recognize that LID are a potential solution to the hydrological drivers of the urban stream syndrome. We've heard that over and over again, but if you drill down, at a watershed scale, what would be the right mix of the different types of LID that one might implement if you wanted to protect stream health, and also, what volumes of water should be specifically harvested and infiltrated. So I wanted to share with you a paper that was actually published by it was first authored by one of my graduate students, Asal Askarizadeh. But it was kind of a hive mind paper in the sense that we brought together researchers across the PIRE and tried to address this this question in a kind of holistic way. And so if you go to slide 3, that's entitled The Urban Stream Syndrome, I think we've all now seen this a number of times. Basically, as Rich pointed out, the urban stream syndrome is a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms. And sadly, all of these pictures were taken from Orange County, where UC Irvine is located. So, so these are all images of this urban stream syndrome that are actually quite close to home. And basically, the paper that I'm going to be talking about appeared last year in Environmental Science and Technology, and so that's the title and set of authors if you want to learn more. So if you go to the next slide, that is entitled Increased Imperviousness Alters Stream Hydrology in 2 Ways. And this really comes from Chris Walsh's fine work and colleagues at the University of Melbourne, and kind of gets to the heart of one of the main drivers of the urban stream syndrome. And basically the idea is that during wet weather, you have too much water being delivered through formal drainage systems to streams. And what I mean by formal drainage systems are essentially the meat and potatoes of civil engineering, right? We train our undergrads to design formal drainages, and then they go to work for flood control districts who are very good at trying to reduce the risk of flooding in urban settings. And that means building hydraulically efficient systems that move runoff from the urban landscape to receiving waters very, very quickly. And as we've heard, that has all sorts of unfortunate ecological consequences, which is something that, for the PIRE, we're trying to bring that dimension to engineering undergraduate studies. So if you go to the next click in the animation, so basically you have the flip problem, again in settings where you don't have a lot of interbasin transfers of water, so I guess so take LA off the table here, but during dry weather, because you put this imperviousness down on the landscape, basically that shuts down infiltration of water, rainwater, and infiltration of water into the subsurface is a major source of base flow in streams in most watersheds. And so if you cut that off, then basically you reduce the base flow. So you have this kind of schizophrenic problem, right? You've got too much flow during rain events, and you have too little base flow during dry weather events. Again, excluding interbasin transfer issues. And if you click to the next animation, basically these two changes in the hydrologic regime of streams are primary causes of the urban stream syndrome, the pictures of which we saw in that earlier slide. And one can start getting kind of nerdy about it. I come from an engineering background, and so again, kind of building off of some of Chris Walsh's and Tim Fletcher's very nice studies looking at applying environmental flow concepts to the urban stream syndrome. We can just sort of riff off that. So there's a series of animations I'm going to click through. The first one basically is titled Annual Catchment Water Balance Pre-Urban, and I'm going to just click to that box there. And so in a pre-urban state, you can sort of imagine in a very, very simplified way, right, that the watershed is like a bucket. and that bucket receives rainfall in the form of mean annual rainfall. That's what MAR is. So that's kind of the input of water to the bucket. Some of that mean annual rainfall or flow into the bucket is going back to the atmosphere as evapotranspiration, as we've heard. And then some of it is being infiltrated in the subsurface, and the key thing is that subsurface flow is, at least in part, supplying base flow in streams during dry weather periods. And so if you click on the next part of the animation, basically you can write out that, annual water budget. So we're talking about an annual water budget in a really simple way. You basically say that the mean annual rainfall equals the evapotranspiration, click on the next animation, plus the annual stream flow, that's that S sub, which is in this conceptualization fed by subsurface infiltration. And of course, if you're watching carefully and you're not asleep yet, you'll immediately point out that not all of the infiltration is going to go to the stream. Some of it might be lost to deep groundwater. But for the sake of this, this model, the simplification is that essentially all the water that infiltrates eventually makes it to the stream. So what happens when we start urbanizing, but we don't have low impact development? So that's the next set of animations. Basically what happens is that we reduce the subsurface area, so we don't have as much infiltration going to the stream through the groundwater route or interflow route. And instead, we've got this formal drainage, which is represented by the runoff arrow. And that formal drainage is now delivering a large volume of water during storms directly to the stream. And we're referring to that stream flow as S sub EI here. So basically what we've done is we've changed the balance of the mean annual rainfall between ET, stream flow from subsurface transport of water, and then we've added this new term, stream flow from effective imperviousness, or that connected imperviousness that we were talking about. And you might wonder, how can you calculate the stream flow from the groundwater route and from effective imperviousness? And basically you can use this very simple set of equations which rely on stream coefficients and the fraction of the watershed which is essentially covered with effective imperviousness, or that connected imperviousness. And then in the bottom equation, that the stream flow from effective imperviousness, we're relying on an impervious runoff coefficient. And the key thing to note here is the stream coefficient and the impervious runoff coefficient can be measured and have been measured. And we'll get back to that in a second. So that's enough math. Let's just look at this graphically. So if we just choose arbitrarily, not entirely arbitrarily, but we just choose a couple of example values for the stream coefficient and the effective imperviousness coefficient of 0.3 and 0.8, we get graphs like the one shown on the bottom here, where at an effective imperviousness of 0, that would be the unurbanized state. Essentially 30% of the mean annual rainfall, that is 0.3 fraction, is going to subsurface flow and supporting stream flow, base flow in the streams, while the other portion, the 70%, is going to evapotranspiration. So that's kind of the pre-urban state. And then as we increase effective imperviousness, and that's the horizontal axis there, so we're increasing the fraction of the urban landscape which is covered with connected imperviousness to streams, what's happening is that the subsurface flow is being reduced because we're laying down that impervious surface and infiltration is reduced. Evapotranspiration is reduced because we're taking forests and grasslands and replacing them with impervious surfaces. And all of that extra water is going to impervious runoff. And so you see this really dramatic shift in the distribution of mean annual rainfall, with much more red region, which is that impervious runoff, which is so bad for streams. So how do we fix that? And so, you know, thinking about LID through the lens of trying to repair this particular problem, what would we want to do? In the next animation, I'm basically showing a replumbing of that bucket, right? So we have all of that runoff from the connected imperviousness, and what we want to do is we want to capture all of it, ideally, locally, and do one of two things with it. We infiltrate it to the extent that we need to enhance the subsurface flow to mimic pre-urban conditions. And then the rest of that runoff we so-called harvest. We essentially use it for purposes which keep it out of the stream. So that's kind of the basic concept. And then if you click on the next animation, that you're seeing the sort of water balance that goes with that concept. Mean annual rainfall basically consists of these two terms in parentheses. One really represents the pre-urban evapotranspiration, which is the evapotranspiration under urban conditions, plus all the harvested water that you pick up with LID. And then the second term represents the pre-urban annual stream flow, again through subsurface routes, which in the urban case basically becomes a combination of what is left to infiltrate plus the infiltrated LID that we implement in the watershed. So that's kind of the basic concept. And if you go to the next slide, we're showing that replumbing graphically. Again, the same scenario. We have a stream coefficient of 0.3 and an effective imperviousness coefficient of 0.8. And what you're seeing in this slide is that the combination of subsurface flow and infiltrated runoff always equal 0.3% as the effective imperviousness increases. So the base flow is then unchanged. And then that extra wedge, the kind of pinkish red fraction of MAR at the bottom of that graph is the harvested runoff. So that's the runoff that we have available to use for toilet flushing and other activities which keep the water at least directly going into the stream. So that's kind of the basic concept. If you go to the next slide, the question that I want to get to now is, what is the best mix of distributed LID for a specific catchment? And of course, the answer to that question would depend on what your end goal is. But if you go to the next slide, keep clicking, sorry. If you had as an end goal restoring pre-urban stream hydrology, like they're trying to do, at least partially in Little Stringy Bark Creek, then as indicated in this nice Walsh et al. Paper that I highly recommend that you guys have a look at, there's these basic principles, right? One is that you would try to capture all of that stormwater. So this is basically the same thing I just showed graphically, but in words. So you capture all of the stormwater locally. You don't let any of it flow directly to the stream through the formal drainage system. A portion of that captured stormwater, you're going to infiltrate to again restore the shallow groundwater and base flow in the stream. So that's exactly what we were saying with the infiltrated LID. And then the rest you harvest, you keep it out of the stream. So I'm basically just saying the same thing I did mathematically, but now in words. And if you click to the next slide, I'm showing a picture of some examples of biofilters configured in either an infiltration mode, which I'm going to start with, or in a harvest mode in a moment. So in an infiltration mode, the idea is that you would take that, and you can click forward one slide, you would take road runoff or roof runoff, you'd run it through into the biofilter, which of course is a vertically oriented system. We're going to hear more about that, I think, toward the end of this session. So the water ponds at the top, that little inset over in the lower right, the water ponds on the top, and then slowly moves through filter media, interacts with plants, and hopefully is cleaned in the process. The real point here is that this particular biofilter is unlined. And so if you think about where that water goes, it really goes to two places. One, some of it is going to evapotranspire because you've got plants and evaporation going on. So some of it's going to go back in the atmosphere, which is a good thing. That's a form of harvesting. And then the rest of it is going to infiltrate. And so in this mode, you've got some of that flow coming into the biofilter that's essentially harvested back into the atmosphere, and then some of it which is infiltrated into shallow groundwater to support stream flow. So if you go to the next slide, you can also operate a biofilter in a harvesting framework by just simply lining it so that the water, as it filters through the system, does not then enter the local groundwater, but instead goes into a pipe, which then you could treat and pump back into your home for maybe toilet flushing and other activities. And again, in this case, what we're essentially doing with that extra water is, again, some of it's going to go up into evapotranspiration, it's harvesting. The rest of it's going to go back into the home and be used for various purposes. Again, we call that harvesting. Eventually, it goes to the sanitary sewer system, is treated, and hopefully disposed of in a ecologically safe and friendly way. So if we want to restore pre-urban hydrology, the next question is how much of the stormwater runoff should be infiltrated versus harvested? I mean, we know that we want to restore these pre-urban conditions, but what is the right mix of the two types of LID? And it turns out because the stream coefficient depends on the stream coefficient of the natural environment depends on the number of trees you have, essentially the fraction of the land that's forested, as well as on the mean annual rainfall. The answer to that question really is that the ratio of infiltrated to harvested runoff depends on the fraction of pre-urban land and on MAR, that mean annual rainfall. And the next graph is kind of showing that pictorially. Let me kind of walk you through this. So the vertical axis is showing the pre-urban fraction of forest. So if you imagine Los Angeles before anybody got here, depending on where you were in Southern California, you would probably be somewhere along that vertical axis. Pasadena, I was guessing, was about 20% forested, and so that's that C1 there. City 1 would be my guess at what Pasadena might have looked at like in Southern California. And it has mean annual rainfall of around 480 millimeters. So that's the C1 point. So that's the vertical axis, and again, the horizontal axis is the mean annual rainfall for a given region. The color basically is the ratio of the volume which you should infiltrate relative to the volume you should harvest for LID, expressed as a percent. So 100% means that you would infiltrate and harvest exactly the same volumes to maintain pre-urban condition, pre-urban hydrology. And the key thing that I want to, well, I guess there's one more thing I want to say. You can kind of see a general gradient going from red, which is a low percentage in the upper left, to kind of a deep purple, which is a high percentage in the lower right. And this really has to do with that pre-urban fraction of forest, because trees are very good at evapotranspiring. So they're much more effective at moving water into the atmosphere than is a grassland. And so as you increase the fraction of forest, basically that means that under the pre-urban condition, there was less water infiltrating. More of it was going back into the atmosphere. And that's particularly the case as the annual rainfall becomes low. And so that's why in that upper left corner, we're predicting that you should have much less emphasis on infiltration and more emphasis on harvesting to sort of mimic that, what used to be a lot of evapotranspiration from trees. The main thing that I want to say, there's a couple main things, I guess. One is the dark black line over toward the right is the 100% line. So that's the case where basically the volume of runoff that you should infiltrate and harvest is exactly equal. And if you imagine this plot represents the world, right? Most of the world lies to the left of that black line, which means that in general, we need to infiltrate much less than we need to harvest. And that's great news for, water-starved areas like Southern California, where we could use that stormwater runoff for other purposes, basically potable substitution, like flushing toilets. The other thing I wanted to point out is that thin line that goes through Pasadena, C1, that's essentially corresponding to the 30% infiltration to harvest ratio. So in Pasadena, we would ideally have a combination of LID, again, that captured all the runoff, and that 30% of the runoff was infiltrated relative to harvested. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that line crosses through C2, which is a very, very different environment. That would be Baltimore, Maryland. So a much wetter region with a much higher pre-urban fraction of forest. So you can basically have the same infiltration to harvest ratio in very different regions of the world. So clicking forward, how might we choose low impact development technologies to achieve a given harvest infiltration ratio? The beautiful thing about this framework is that basically we're just looking at getting the right ratio of infiltration to harvesting, and that means that we can categorize all LID technologies on the basis of the percentage of runoff that they harvest, infiltrate, or leave as runoff. And how do we do that? Well, we thought about it a little while, we argued about it, and we came up with this ternary diagram, which I'm calling here the LID universe. And basically, the key thing about ternary diagrams, in case you haven't encountered them before, is that any point in that ternary diagram kind of conserves mass. In other words, the end members have to add to 100%. So that dot that I've got located on the ternary diagram is essentially corresponding to 50% overland runoff, 40% harvested runoff, and 10% infiltrated runoff. And again, those add up to 100% of the runoff. So the key thing is that we can begin to populate this ternary diagram with different kinds of LID technologies. So let's start on the next slide with a biofilter, which is essentially unlined. So it's going to infiltrate, and it's also going to harvest through evapotranspiration. Basically, that's going to be toward the lower left. And these regions that we're mapping out here are actually based on published performance data for different LID. So it kind of maps over to the left on line biofilters. Click forward, line biofilters actually span a very large region because you can get different degrees of infiltration and harvesting with these guys depending on how you configure them. So they're actually quite versatile. If we just plot that in the next animation, the 30% infiltration to harvest ratio, that just plots down the ternary diagram. So we would be looking then for either combinations or individual LID, which sort of give us overall, when integrated over the watershed, that 30% infiltration to harvest ratio if we were in Pasadena, for example. Clicking forward, we can add things like green roofs and rain tanks and wetlands, which are really just about primarily harvesting, although a lot of them also leave the runoff going to streams. On the other hand, we can talk about infiltration trenches, and permeable pavement with drains and no drains. And these tend to plot to the left because they're more infiltrative. And then finally, we added dry biosoils. Here is that green polygon in the next slide. So the point that I'm trying to make is that you could sort of see a sequence of ideas here that could guide the development of LID in a particular urban watershed. First, you start with kind of what is the pre-urban hydrology you're trying to get to. Second, what is the ratio of infiltration to harvesting of runoff that would achieve that pre-urban hydrology that you're interested in? And then that kind of leads to this sort of ternary diagram framework where you can start looking at the combinations of different LIDs that would give you that particular ratio. So here are my conclusions. Imperviousness changes stream hydrology by increasing flow during storm and reducing base flow during dry weather. Exception being Los Angeles, where we've imported so much water that we actually have more base flow in the summer than we used to. Next slide. Distributed LID can restore pre-urban hydrology provided that all of the stormwater is harvested and infiltrated with an infiltration to harvest ratio that depends on the mean annual rainfall of your location and the pre-urban forest cover corresponding to your particular area. And when we map that out, we find that for most regions of the world, including Southern California, much more water should be harvested than infiltrated, which is a really great thing for reducing urban water or increasing urban water security. So with that, I'm very happy to take questions, and thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Stan. That was really interesting. So any questions for Stan?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Perrin. Yeah.
Thanks, Stan. It was a lovely talk as usual. You've got a very elegant reductionist approach. It's a good way of getting insight. But I'm going to be a scientist, and which we always try to muddle things up. Engineers try to make things clear. I think scientists try to muddle things up, and it's just based on my own anecdotal experience. So in areas like Clayton, which is aptly named, there's a lot of clay in the soil. So again, I'm not a hydrologist, but my feeling is it's going to be very hard to get infiltration into those areas. I presume that sort of obviously factors in as well into the, A, into how much infiltration there was prior to settlement, and then B, obviously guidelines and practice need to take into account how
Right.
how possible it is to get infiltration to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to look at that review article that I mentioned at the beginning, about a third of it would be the reductionist stuff that I talked about, and yay, we can do this, and it's really interesting. And then the other 2/3 is, wow, it's very site specific and very complicated and very path dependent. And so you're absolutely correct. I mean, and there's so many exceptions to the rule that maybe there isn't a rule anymore. Because of the fact that, I mean, just to list off a few, the sort of presence of clay may limit infiltration. On the other hand, there was a talk by Scott Taylor a couple of days ago on the earlier symposium. He was basically caveating all of this with concerns about groundwater contamination and transferring pollutants and surface water into groundwater, which is extremely difficult to remediate. I know that Tim in Little Stringy Bark Creek was very concerned about essentially pushing contaminants that were already in the ground essentially into the stream and causing more damage through increasing base flow. And there's a lot of interesting kind of unintended consequences having to do with redox chemistry. In the area that I live in, the San Diego Creek Watershed has a lot of selenium in it, and as that the subsurface water becomes oxygenated, it can mobilize the selenium into streams, and then it becomes a massive water quality issue. So yeah, absolutely. I think that really this is just a way of beginning to think about how you would go from individual unit scales to watershed scales, but then of course all of the details of individual watersheds are going to have to come into play.
Yeah, thanks.
Other questions? So I have a question about forests. So I should know what a forest is, but I'm not sure what a forest is in your, arrangement there, because, I mean, we have shrubs, we have chaparral, so we have native vegetation. They're just not trees. And so I'm not sure how much difference it makes what the vegetation type is, and does it have to be a tree?
Yeah, well, I can be very specific about what that forest refers to, the F, the fraction of forest. That basically comes from an article published in Water Resources Research back in 2001, which I think has probably about 1,000 or so citations now, in which they took all of the stream coefficients from around, as many stream coefficients as they could collect from around the world, and they essentially developed a hydrological model, which ultimately led to a correlation between the stream coefficient and mean annual rainfall and fraction of forest as they defined it. So, so I think that it's a very I think that unpacking that would be very interesting. It's probably beyond what I could do, but it would be interesting to look back at that data set and see if the kinds of systems that you're referring to are included in the database that was utilized in Zhang.
Yeah, it's kind of strange because it depends on the context. Because mostly when people say forest, they mean trees, and that certainly might be the case here. But like the Forest Service, I mean, they do forest restoration in our local chaparral. I mean, and when you talk about forest fires or the Forest Service, they would pay attention to that vegetation too. So I just don't really know.
Yeah, and I think that in that particular case, I have no idea, I should say, but I would imagine chaparral is acclimated to pretty dry climates, and so therefore the evapotranspiration would be pretty low.
It is, yeah, that's true.
So it would absolutely go contrary to the kind of global assessment that Zhang et al. Is talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there time for one more quick question, or do you need to move on?
I think we should take it.
Okay. I had a chance to comment on this earlier, so I feel bad for saying something now. But I noticed for the wetlands, it's all, either 100%, and on your ternary diagram, it's 100% overland runoff or 100% harvest with no infiltration. Since some of these do discharge downstream or to other areas, I mean, is it true to say that there's no infiltration going on when a wetland is put in?
I think that this is on a unit by unit basis. So thinking about it from an engineering perspective, it's like a unit operation. It's like a a specific engineered system that you're putting into the ground. And so if sort of the concept was, and I really like this process because it kind of enforced some discipline in thinking, right? If you put a wetland in, one of the things that's characteristic about the wetland is that there's water there's water in it even during potentially dry weather periods, and that means that you're not, it can be flowing horizontally, but it's not infiltrating. And I'm sure that there are exceptions to that. It's not 100%, but as a general rule, you wouldn't want to have a lot of infiltration in the wetland because it would dry out.
Okay.
And in many of these engineered systems, they're actually lined.
Right.
Mega's giving me some little assists. It's like lined. Yeah. So that's the other thing. I think from an engineering perspective, they would be lined.
Okay.